Hi, I'm Tim Smith, and you're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com.
Hi everyone, John Liebman here. You're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com. Today we are on location at the University of Miami in sunny Florida with none other than Tim Smith. How you doing, Tim?
I'm good, John. Great to see you.
Well, I'd like to talk about you. I've read a lot, I've heard about a lot about your background, and I'd just like to hear you tell your story. And why don't we start from your musical upbringing? You're from the Carolinas originally, right?
I am. My family is really musical royalty in the Carolinas. My father and my uncle started really on radio in the 40s. They were a family of 5 children, 3 sons, and the 3 sons all played instruments. And by the time they were 12 or 13 years old, they had their own radio shows. So I grew up in that situation. They had the first recording studio in that part of the country. James, everything from Flat and Scruggs we recorded to Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. My uncle and dad produced that record. And
the original James Brown.
And then we had a weekly radio show with James Brown for 15 years.
You got to meet him?
I was with him some. Yeah, he was amazing. And as a child, I had a good friend, Johnny Cash. We did all of Johnny's music publishing, and he was a dear friend of our family. And he was at our house one time, and one of my buddies came over when I was probably 10 or 11 years old, and he called his mom and said, "Can I stay for supper? Johnny Cash is here." And they're like, "You quit lying to us." And the parents came over. Of course, he's there. And I think I felt like everybody grew up like I did. I realized much later that how incredibly special my life was. My very first experience on television, I had learned to play some stuff on Hammond organ. And they were going to do this religious recitation. And they said, "Well, Tim, play the organ." And
How old were you?
I was maybe 8 or 9. The only song I knew was House of the Rising Sun, because it was a great organ song. Yes, so I'm playing that behind this religious recitation. I think my father was falling over laughing in the band off camera. But
that's great. How did you gravitate to the bass?
I guess I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and my father gave me a guitar for Christmas. And I played it for about a minute. And my brother, who, like I said, was 3 years older, came and grabbed it and could immediately play an F chord, which I was never going to be able to play an F chord. And so he took the guitar, and about a week or two later, my father comes in with a Hofner Beetle bass. And that was my first instrument.
Did you start noticing the bass and bass players on records?
Absolutely. I mean, that's probably what you and I and probably most bass players have in common, is that my ears gravitated toward what the bass player was doing. And
did you learn any bass players' names? Did you have any influences? You were awfully young, but once you finally got to that point where you were a bass player and you were tuned into the bass and you appreciated the instrument and the people that played it, did you have some musical influences? Who were you inspired by?
I did, and I didn't know their names at the time because
probably James Jamerson was one.
Of course, James was, and those guys weren't getting credit on the records at this point. So I told Carol Kay one time, I said, "I'm sure you were an influence on me," and I didn't even know it because of all the records she was playing on. But I love bands like the Dave Clark Five and all the soul music. In the Carolinas, there's a kind of music we call beach music, which is it's rhythm and blues. Sometimes made by white artists, but most of the time it was groups like the Drifters, Temptations. They would have a national hit, but that hit would stay in the Carolinas, and they created a dance called the shag. So there was this R&B music that was just huge in the Carolinas, and there was, even though we certainly had our racial issues there, when it came to music, the color line was dropped. You go see James Brown at the Coliseum in Charlotte, and it's at least as many white people as black people. And at least for that 3 hours, there was no color line, So, and I was certainly influenced by James's guys. Every time he came through town, he had a different bass player. So I didn't get to know any of their names, but they were all incredible. They all played just alike. But what it was all about was James was telling them what to play. My father and uncle were both on a label in Nashville called Monument Records, which was owned by Fred Foster, who produced all the Roy Orbison records, Willie Nelson, Brenda Lee. He was one of the real gurus of Nashville. And he told me, he said, "If you move to Nashville, I'll use your own records." I moved to Nashville. My first day in Nashville, Fred Foster starts making calls, and he calls Chet Atkins. And, of course, I knew him through my family. But he calls this other guy. His name's Bill Justice. He's a big arranger. He comes in, and I recognized him I knew I'd seen him before. Well, he was Kenny's producer and arranger. So he just looked at me and goes, "Oh, yeah, I remember you. You sound great." He said, "I'll call you sometime," which in Nashville means you may get a call at some point in your life, but not likely. I got home, he called. He said, "I need you for 6 o'clock tonight at the Sound Emporium." I said, "Okay." So I walk in. Nobody's there but him, the engineer, and me. And he says, "I need you to replace the bass on a couple of tunes." He said, "I'm not going to put your name on the record because the guy who played bass on the record, it'll hurt his feelings. But I need you to replace the bass." I said, "Okay, no problem." He hands out this chart. He goes, "Can you read this?" Well, the hardest thing on there was a dotted quarter to an eighth. It was the easiest, after being down here and reading is like. So I played it, and it felt like Margaritaville. It was one of those kind of feelings. And I didn't hear any vocal on it. And so I played the bass down first try, and he was like, "Wow, that was great." I was like, "Well, that was easy, but the groove was great." I said, "Who is that?" He says, "Well, it's Ken Butchery on drums, and that's the guy that played on Margaritaville." I was like, "Well, that's cool." I said, "Who's the singer?" And he pushes the fader up, and it's Tom Jones. And when he pushes the fader up, this guy who's been sleeping on the couch raises up, and it's Tom. Oh. And he's like, "Oh, you sound great on there." So I was all excited.
That is an interesting.
I was getting paid double scale because I was the only musician in the room. I also joined forces with Joe English, who had been Paul McCartney and Wings drummer.
Right.
And we were one of the really early influential bands in the contemporary Christian business. And Amy Grant was one of our opening acts.
Oh, I worked with her.
And so we really were in the cutting edge of that. Dove Award-winning band, and did really well, toured a lot. And so I got my foot in the door with that world. So I played on tons and tons of Christian records.
Tell me about your equipment. You play Ken Smith bass, don't you?
I do. I met Ken at a NAMM show in Nashville years ago, and we really hit it off. And I've got 15 or 20 basses. I've got old Fenders. I've got the bass that Papa was got a brand new bag was recorded on, and that's a 1961 P bass. It's incredible. Just incredible instruments. And I'll call Ken Smith up and go, you killed me here, man. This is so much better than anything else I've ever played.
What do you like about the Smiths better than the others?
You know what? It's such an intangible. I like the sound, obviously, but when I put my hand on the neck, it's the fit. It's just like everything. I was just thinking that today, the distance between the string and the body in the right hand, if it's too much, you feel like you've got this big space there and it's uncomfortable. If it's not enough, you can't get anything in between there. This is perfect. The neck width is perfect for me. This neck through 20th anniversary, the neck, because the way it attaches, it's so thin at that end that you can play up to the high G without ever feeling like you're having to expend any effort. It's just perfect. It's helped me make money. I mean, it really has been a huge tool in the...
That's a nice perk, too. How about the future, Tim? What else would you like to do? You've done an awful lot, and you still have, obviously, a lot of energy, a lot of notes left in you. What else would you like to do?
You know, I want to be as good a teacher as I can be. I want to impact some people. I love producing records, but, at my core, if somebody had to say, all right, you got to do a business card, and you can only put one thing on there, it's still going to say bass player.
What would you be if you were not a bass player? It has to be something outside of music.
Outside of music, wow. Well, I've watched enough Law and Order. I really feel like I could be an attorney. But, that's such a hard question because being who I am and growing up the way I did, I just am convinced that this was my DNA.
There you go. Well, keep us posted on all that great stuff.
John, thank you so much for being here.
Well, man, Tim Smith, thank you. It's great getting to know you in person after all our electronic communication. And keep doing what you're doing. We'll keep enjoying it, and we'll watch for lots more great stuff from you.
Thank you so much, John.
On location at the University of Miami in sunny Florida, I'm John Liebman. You're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com.